Everybody see this?
Okay.
Are we ready?
We're ready.
Well, welcome to our Spanish-American War presentation. Thank you very much for everybody coming here. There's a lot to talk about, there's a lot to learn. I've got a little script here that I wanted to honor somebody here in the audience, and that's Ron Tromer. More than 60 years ago, Ron Tromer was saved by a Spanish soldier who was in the U.S. Army during the Korean War. And he was from Puerto Rico. And so I can tell you that he says that if this Spanish person by the name of Rodriguez had not saved his life, he wouldn't be here today. So Ron earned the Purple Heart and was in the Korean War, and so he's thankful for this soldier by the name of Rodriguez. Now, our speaker and facilitator for today's inquiry into the Spanish-American War is Tony Cooper, and committed to constant personal learning to improve his potential contribution. The question that will guide the Spanish-American War presentation was the Spanish-American War a splendid war, one that attained its objectives, was over quickly, cost little, and had no negative effects. The Spanish-American War session will include TOMAH Historical Society board member comments. And if we had any students, they could ask questions too. Now, does anybody know when the Spanish-American War took place? What year? 1898, after the Civil War. That's very important to remember, because I want to say real briefly, and then I'm going to turn it over to Tony. The Spanish-American War contributed to the United States of being a world power. It's the first war that we had outside the United States. And if we weren't involved in the Spanish-American War, we wouldn't have Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, an interest in Cuba at that particular time, and so that was very important. It only lasted 4 months and some days. That's why people kind of gloss it over or don't remember it. But there was an extension of the war that went all the way until 1903, and that was the Filipino Wars too. So there was an extension of the Spanish-American War, but precisely the Spanish-American War was 1898, and here TOMAH. Now the soldiers from TOMAH, that's what we're concentrating on today, there were 105 soldiers, and they were part of the National Guard. So they were called up, as many people as could get into the Spanish-American War. And who influenced that? It was McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, General Wheeler, and Fitzroy Lee. Now here's one interesting thing. After the Civil War, there were Confederate soldiers that went home. Well, during the Spanish-American War, some of those Confederate soldiers became Union soldiers for the Spanish-American War. So you had soldiers that were in the Union, in the Mexican War, then they were Confederate in the Civil War, then they were back into the Union during the Spanish-American War. That's all I got at this time for you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Tony. Thank you.
Thank you, Wayne, for the great introduction. I want to start out by thanking the TOMAH Historical Society for this opportunity to speak about the Spanish-American War. To start out, I'd like to ask John Freilich, the President, what was the Spanish-American War and why was it important?
The Spanish-American War, of course, started in 1898. The United States was feeling its muscle for the first time in its history outside the borders of the United States. There were two combatants were the United States and the Spanish Empire. And the Spanish were a world power in the 16th century. Conquistadors conquered most of South and Central America. There was a great deal of treasure transported in the form of gold and silver from South America to Spain. Spain was probably the only world power in that period. But by the early 19th century, Spain was losing its American colonies. There were revolutions that created Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile, as an example. These were all lost by probably the mid-1820s. There was one Spanish possession that was in the continental United States that was not affected so much by this revolution. That was Florida. And Florida was basically purchased with money and also some military action from Spain in 1820 by the United States. Other parts of the Spanish territory, which were part of Mexico, were of course California, Texas, and some other Arizona and New Mexico. And we acquired those during the Mexican War in the mid-1840s. The United States had an interest in Cuba for really a long time, going back to the 1840s. People in the southern part of the country were concerned about losing control of their slaveholding states, and they looked to Cuba as a place where they could probably continue their operations of slavery. The United States, after the Civil War, attempted to buy Cuba, and the Spanish government did not want to sell Cuba. In the meantime, there was several Cuban insurrections going on, and during this period there were Cuban revolutionary groups that organized in the United States, in New York and also in Philadelphia. And there was also a group of people called filibusters. And you may have heard the term in referring to it as a way as continuous debate in the U.S. Senate. But filibusters were basically individuals that, in most cases, were American citizens that aided the Cubans monetarily, weapons, and other ways, so they could continue their revolution. And I think Tony is going to discuss later that there are actually 3 different revolutionary periods, starting in the late 1860s and continuing up until 1895, which was kind of the revolution that started the Spanish-American War. During this time, in one instance, the Cuban revolutionaries were attempting to transport arms and men from Florida to Cuba. There were 3 vessels in this period. The United States seized 2 of them, prevented them from going to Cuba. But the Cubans were better organized in 1895 than they were in the earlier wars, And it was to such a degree that they had control of quite large parts of Cuba. Now, the Spanish government did not particularly care for this. And one of the efforts to try to separate the revolutionaries from the general population was started around 1896, and there were internment camps. They've been called concentration camps and other terms. And what the Spanish government was attempting to do was separate the revolutionaries from the general population. It went badly. General population was segregated in areas. There was a lot of starvation. There was over 100,000 people who died because there was inadequate food, and the Spanish could not really deal with the situation. The other thing that was happening is that Spain was a major trading partner with the United States. I read that there was $100 million in business between the United States and the Spanish government involving Cuba. Principally it was sugar, and the Cuban revolutionaries decided that they were going to destroy sugarcane, destroy refineries as a means of hurting the Spanish governing body. The other situation was that there was a treaty between the United States and Spain, a trade treaty, similar to the situation we have now with some other countries. And the Spanish basically voided the treaty. There were also two major newspapers in the United States that were very interested in boosting their circulation. The New York Journal, which was publisher was William Randolph Hearst, and the New York World, Joseph Pulitzer was a publisher. And Hearst especially wanted to foment conflict in Cuba. And he sent Frederick Remington, who was a Western artist and illustrator, to Cuba and told him he wanted, of course photography was not as advanced as it was some years later. He told him to draw pictures. And Remington was bored. He cabled Hearst, "There's no trouble here, can I come home?" And Hearst said, "You provide the illustrations, I'll provide the war," which he did. And you may have heard the term yellow journalism. Well, Hearst was an expert at this, and he got people riled up in the United States about how terrible it was in Cuba and what the Spanish were doing to these poor innocent Cubans and why we should be involved in it. Then we come to the battleship Maine, which was a second-class battleship. It was part of the United States' new Iron Navy. And prior to the 1890s, the United States was probably 20th as a power as far as the Navy was concerned. We started building ships. One of the ships we built was the U.S. name, which was commissioned in 1895. The U.S. government was concerned about United States citizens and also United States property in Cuba. And the Maine was sent in January 1898 to Cuba with the idea to kind of keep the peace, so to speak. But on the other hand, we didn't want to so much trample on Spanish rights. So the crew on the Maine was confined to the ship. Officers were allowed to take shore leave, but in civilian clothes, not in uniforms. But even though this happened, there were people that were very pro-Spanish government. And one of those people approached Captain Charles Sigsbee, who was the captain of the Maine. He was attending a bullfight, showed him a flyer and said, "Well, basically we don't want the United States meddling in our affairs." And similar to what some of the Al-Qaeda people have said, Americans die. This is what this stinks. But Sigsbee went back to the Maine was only supposed to stay in Havana a short period. In fact, a lot of the crew were looking forward to going to New Orleans for Mardi Gras. But Mardi Gras came and went, and the ship was still there. And late in the evening in February, or February 15th, something happened, the main exploded. And it was not known, there have been theories about this ever since. Sigsbee tried, who was on board the ship and was on the part of the ship that wasn't damaged, even though he'd lost 2/3 of his crew, and of course the warship was destroyed, he cabled Washington and said, keep calm, don't send any more ships or anything, let's investigate this thing before we make any assumptions. A Naval Board of Inquiry did an investigation and they determined that the ship was destroyed by a mine. Another story is that the ship actually succumbed to a fire in one of the coal bunkers that was near the ship's magazine, and the heat from the fire caused the magazine to explode. And these are probably the two different aspects of what happened in Maine. Well, if it was a mine, who planted the mine? And the theory was, well, the Spanish might have done it, but maybe the Cuban revolutionaries did it in order to stimulate the United States to take action. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, and I don't hope that I'm treading too much on Tony's presentation. But there was the ambassador of Spain to the United States, and after the time between the time that the Maine blew up and the war actually started, he sent a letter, and I'll mispronounce his name, I'm sure. His name was Delome. He sent a letter to his superiors in Spain and said, McKinley is nothing, don't worry about McKinley, he's not going to do anything. He's more interested in his political standing in the government. Well, this letter got out and it got into Congress, and congressmen were very affronted that the president was being vilified, and it kind of had a similar effect as far as the war started as the Zimmerman letter did in 1918, which was a letter sent by a German ambassador to the Mexican government. You keep the Americans out of our affairs in Europe and we'll see that you get back some of this territory that you lost during the Mexican War. But this letter was one of the things, the Delome letter, was one of the things that basically helped to start the war. And Tony, go ahead.
Thank you. Now, do you see why the title of the presentation is The Beginning of a Splendid Little War? Look at what's happened already. We're a small group of people. We had a presentation that was going to require the use of an overhead projector. The overhead projector didn't work, did it? We talk about, I introduced the president of the TOMAH Historical Society. He presents a very eloquent position on what happened. That's not held by everybody. Just think a second. When you talk about the blowing up of the Maine, is there evidence of who actually blew it up? Is there evidence about the potential motives? Papers came out and said, we know who did it. There'd been no investigation, no trial. That created an impetus towards war. But there's something that a lot of people don't know about the Cuban War, or the Cuban portion of the Spanish-American War. They failed to take into consideration what the overall American strategy was at the time. How many of you have ever heard of Alfred Thayer Mahan?
I've heard of it.
Well,
I've heard of it, but I can't remember.
Yeah, I
can't either. Yeah.
he was the first head of the Naval War College. He wrote an inspirational book called The Effect of Navies on World History, or the Sea Lanes on American History. And he spoke about his vision about where the United States could go in terms of economic growth and in terms of projection of its might around the world. What he spoke about was, number one, there was a need to create a strong navy. He was naval admiral, of course he'd advocate that. But he also talked in terms of having ports of call, where there could be naval refueling stations and there could be coal piled up. And he also spoke about the idea that you'd have a strong merchant marine. And he identified China and Asia as the major opportunity for American growth going into the future. You don't have to do much more than pick up a paper now or listen to a news broadcast and see that a major focus of what's going on in terms of trade is China. Look at what the United States was doing in the 1890s or the early 20th century. To get to a point where the Panama Canal could be created, there was a need to have some land over which you could build the Panama Canal. But there was a problem with that. Nicaragua wouldn't go along with it. Neither would Colombia. There was a spontaneous rebellion among Panamanians. The United States sends a representative to the new country of Panama, and a contract is negotiated, or treaty is negotiated, that made it possible for the United States to build the Panama Canal across Panama. That did wonders for the American Navy. There was no longer the need to have, in effect, two separate navies for opposite shores of the United States. It was possible to concentrate the Navy on one objective by transferring the Navy through the Panama Canal. There also was the overturn of Queen Liliuokalani in Hawaii. Hawaii was a possible substitute source of sugar. It also was a major port of call for the Navy. In 1898, Hawaii was annexed into the United States. So you have those two events which say the United States is creating foundation for having an imperial power throughout the world. Now, how does Cuba fit into this? How does Puerto Rico fit into this? Well, the Monroe Doctrine said that the United States should be the dominant power in the Americas. To prevent another country from coming into the Americas, it was necessary to wall off the possibility that they could have a naval station any place in the Americas. One of the most sought after naval stations was Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is still used by the United States. Another factor in all this is, what is a Cuban? Who is a Cuban? Can anyone tell me who a Cuban is?
A mixture.
That's right.
Spanish and,
The Spanish maintained census records, and there were roughly 36% of the population of Cuba was non-white. That meant they were Afro-Africans. That meant they were mulattoes. A mulatto is someone of mixed white and black descent. Or they were mestizos, which was a Native American or an Indian, and someone who was Spanish. They were a polyglot people, and the composition changed over time. The Spanish had made a decision that they wanted to treat Cuba like a province. It was like Hawaii and the United States. Cuba was a vital part of Spain. The economy of Cuba was a plantation economy. You could look at it as one single crop grown throughout an island. 90% of the market for Cuban sugar was the United States, probably higher. About 40% of the sugar imported into the United States was Cuban sugar. But at the time of the Spanish-American War, substitutes were starting to appear for sugar. You had sugar beets being harvested in North Dakota, as an example, and beets being processed for sugar. You also had various parts of Florida, Louisiana, and Texas, where there was a substantial sugar industry in the United States. This leads to what was happening in the United States during the 1890s. During the 1890s, the United States was in the second deepest recession after the Great Depression of between 1929 and about 1934. This had lasted for almost 6 years. The level of unemployment had reached 15, 16, 17%. Those are rough statistics because there wasn't a Bureau of Labor Statistics at that time. When you tie that to the Tomah area, you get into what were the major industries or companies for which people worked in the Tomah area. Major industries were the railroad industry and they were the lumber industry. The lumber industry got played out. The railroads started to overexpand. There were all these feeder railroads, such as the Goodyear, Neillsville, North Railroad, that got set up for the specific purpose of serving the lumber industry. If there isn't a lumber industry anymore, there's no longer a need for the railroad. So you had two industries that were the major source of economic well-being for the community, and both were played out. What does someone who's a resident of Tomah who has to support a family do? The National Guard becomes a very attractive source of income. The second in command of the Tomah Company K was Alva Goodyear. He, in a way, is a symbol of both the promise of the Spanish-American War and the tragedy. I'll get to that later in the presentation. But the idea was the Spanish-American War created a challenge to the American people. It was a fight between people called the imperialists and isolationists. And imperialists had the idea that the goal for the United States should be to take over other countries. But that doesn't necessarily mean physically take over. It can mean taking over a country economically. It can mean taking over a country socially. A factor that haunted the whole discussion towards Cuba was Hispaniola. Who knows what Hispaniola is? There's an island in the Caribbean where there are two countries. There's the country of Haiti and there's the country of the Dominican Republic. In 1817, there was a Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution led to a Afro-American or African-controlled country. The other half of the island was the Dominican Republic. That was a largely Spanish, largely white part of the country. The threat that posed is that the same thing could have happened all over again in Cuba. Most of the revolutionaries in 1868 or 1878 were Cuban slaves, who also happened to be African. Most of the Cuban revolutionaries in the 1895 to 1898 period were blacks or mulattoes. In the United States, there was a counter movement. The 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution were the Reconstruction Amendments. They dealt with chattel slavery, whether people are property. They dealt with who can be a citizen, and they dealt with the right to vote. The people in the South wanted to roll that back. That created a real contradiction when it came to Cuba. The people who were rebelling in Cuba were asking the question of, why can't we have civil rights? Why can't we be equal people? If that's the case, and the United States supports it, how can it justify segregation in the southern part of the United States? Can you see why President McKinley didn't want to touch getting involved with Cuba? He was talking about the possibility of an internal civil war in the United States. Can you also see why it was important that there be Confederate generals who were seemingly in charge of the operation in Cuba? And one of the generals, Fitz-Berg Lee, happened to be a relative of General Robert E. Lee.
I wondered about that.
He wasn't a son.
A nephew.
He was a nephew. Joseph Wheeler, who had become famous, was also an individual who had been involved with numerous rebel activities. In fact, he led the last charge during the Civil War. And then there were Baker and Rosser, who never led troops in battle during the Spanish-American War. But they provided cover for the President of the United States to say, we're not here to go back to the Reconstructionist